Chapter 8. I take it you're one of the St. Botolph's girls, the white-haired gentleman said. His eyes lingered on my scars, but from him I didn't mind it. There was true fellow feeling in his eyes. Though he was not an old man, his hair was the color of moonlight on water, an unmistakable sign of siren attack. I wondered how much longer he had to live, and whether he yet felt the inevitable decline that would lay him untimely in the grave. The royalties of Denmark and Greece were sirens. I wondered which one of them had mesmerized the man with song before kissing away years of his life. He saw my look of surprise and smiled. Yes, I know of St. Botolph's. I am a product of its counterpart, the Akbar, which is where they send the boys. The Akbar, I repeated. I read about that place in the papers. I thought it was just a prison ship. Prison, reformatory, torture chamber, what difference is there? He glanced around, then raised his voice. I am William Hooper, and I am in charge of security here. Here was, of course, Marlborough House, where I had been sent as an escort to Princess May, in case any anarchist should fling a bomb into the carriage. As we were driving through Piccadilly, by great good luck, or perhaps because, as I was later to learn, the most obstreperous anarchists were even then too busy plotting to dynamite Buckingham Palace to spare any incendiaries for a third-rate princess, we had reached the large red brick house on the Mall in perfect safety. May, very elegant in her refurbished gown and modest diamonds, sparkling in person if not in manner, had gone into the crowded drawing room, and I had found myself in a somewhat smaller room to one side, where a small and select group of upper servants and off-duty plainclothes men had been provided with a small buffet table, a bowl of punch, and every opportunity to enjoy themselves. What ought I to do? I asked Hooper eagerly. Should I be on guard somewhere? Oh no, tonight I have all these tin soldiers to play with, kindly sent by the special branch. Have a pleasant evening, Miss Sharp. I did my best to oblige him. As measured by ice cream, almond cake, and crystallized fruits alone, the evening was very pleasant. The coachmen were not scintillating conversationalists, and the handful of ladies' maids were at first very chilly. But then one of them gathered that I was Princess May's maid, and after that they warmed up. I told them one or two things about my mistress, none of which they didn't know perfectly well themselves, and then spent a pleasant half-hour hinting till it drove them to distraction how much more I could tell them if I wished. Then one of them recalled that she had learned from Lady Sybil St. Clair Erskine's maid that a kitchen maid belonging to Princess Helena had had a remarkable story from the valet of the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein about something very dreadful that had happened to the unfortunate Duke Ernst Gunther yesterday afternoon at the White Lodge, and I had another hour's fun. I don't mean to say that they accepted me as one of their own any more than they would the tiger at the zoo, but I may say that I had the power to fascinate them also, much like that absorbing beast, if not in the same sanguinary manner. It was just as well for me that the loathsome Ernst Gunther was the butt of all the jokes in London this season. Time passed, and the first departures began. As the drawing room slowly emptied, I took myself to a chair in a quiet corner not too far from the crystallized fruits. After 3 cups of punch and 2 hours of pacing about and roaring to frighten the ladies, my head was beginning to ache, and I felt that if I did not have something to occupy myself, I might find myself close to tears. Perhaps it was a risk, but I made myself as inconspicuous as possible, took out Sal's letter and broke the seal. The small, hard, heavy thing inside was a little silver and black enamel brooch shaped like a crescent moon, etched with 7 silver stars. The letter read as follows: St. Botolph's Hospital, Aldgate. Dear Liz, I trust you will never read this letter. It is no use speaking empty words of hope. I shall only promise both of us that I will be careful, and that tomorrow morning I shall be burning this note in a grate somewhere. But if you are reading this, then my precautions are for nothing, and I don't live to see the morning. I hardly know what to say. I wish I had come clean about it before you went away, but I was implored most earnestly to tell no one. You and I both know of the things that go bump in the night, and tonight I am going to meet one of them, that is all. If we don't see each other again, you must know that I am prepared for death. I am not afraid, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and though worms destroy my body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. I bequeath to you this small legacy. It is made of silver, and they say that inherited silver is better than the ordinary kind. Promise me you will wear it always. You are my oldest friend, which is not saying very much, but in our time we have been like sisters, and I know that the truth is a passion with you. Hope very much that one day you will find it, even if I do not. Only remember that truth is not an end in itself. Truth is the handmaiden of justice. What I do tonight is for the sake of justice. I do not ask you to finish my work. I do not even break my vow of secrecy to tell you what work that is. But I hope that as you go in search of truth, you will think of me now and again, and when you remember that I am no longer here to do my work, that for my sake you will use your truth in the service of justice. I will not say goodbye, dear Liz, but till we meet again. Sarah Tanner. I did want to weep again then. I passed the back of my hand across my eyes, and summoned instead a feeling of indignation against Inspector Short. I know that my Redeemer lives. No doubt it would be easier for the most brazen Whitechapel tart to face her maker than it would be for any amount of respectable, clean-living, church-going men who treated their workers like beasts, but this was hardly the sentiment of a woman preparing to abandon her own principles. There was no word of any quarrel with Miss Scrimson in this letter, but it was quite clear that Sal had left St. Botolph's on a mission that she knew might prove dangerous to herself. Sal, my dearest and oldest friend, had gone out to meet her death alone, without a word to me, and I could not understand why. It was a little deeper cut to add to the wound of her loss, but it proved short wrong, and that was the main thing. Sal had not died because she had been surprised by a maniac with a knife. She had died because of something she knew. I was about to put the letter away when I noticed the postscript. Postscript: if by some chance you do wish to finish my work, go to the Whitechapel Public Library at 4 o'clock with a white flower pinned to your coat. But be prepared. The path was not an easy one for me to tread, and I fear it will not be easy for you either. A clue. My heart beat faster with the thrill of the hunt. Sal had not abandoned me then. She had left me the means by which to unravel the mystery of her death. Her warning bore little weight with me. I had already lost my dearest friend. I was not afraid to lose my life, not if there was a chance for justice. That I do not ask you to finish my work, no, but I must do this, at least for the cause of justice. I must bring Sal's murderer to answer for his crimes. A stir over by the door to the room distracted me. The ladies' maids and some of the coachmen clustered at the door, whispering excitedly, and a plain clothes man was trying to warn them back. I caught Princess May's name, so I pinned Sal's silver brooch to the high neck of my black dress, tucked the letter into my pocket again, and went to join them. What is happening? The Duke of Clarence has taken Princess May into the library. Alone. Do you think he's going to propose? Ladies and gentlemen, some order please. Let me see. I elbowed my way through the excited gaggle, evaded the harried policeman's attempt to head me off, and stuck my head through the doorway. Beyond, a small anteroom divided the library from the drawing room where the servants had been entertained. Its door was closed, and a rather slight and dapper gentleman was pacing in front of it like a sentry on his beat. He wore a short, pointed beard in the fashionable imperial style adopted by the horrible Ernst Gunther, but his barber had done a much better job of his hair, and unlike the unfortunate Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, his coat and trousers were cut so beautifully as to make the angels weep for joy. This well-clad gentleman shot me a resentful look and said, "Shut that door. Dim your eyes." "Yes, sir, at once," said the plainclothes man, and I withdrew my nose just in time to save it. The other ladies around me fluttered and whispered, but I could not pay attention to them, being filled with irrational disquiet. What if May wanted me? What if she had misinterpreted Prince Eddie's interest in her? I had left Sal to her own devices, and look what had happened there. The whole house was full of large, imposing windows covered lightly with filmy curtains. Doubtless the pattern would hold true in the library. One could almost certainly see through, if one was strong and agile enough to climb upon the outside sill and press one's face to the glass. In the time it took me to develop the plan, I had crossed the drawing room to the opposite doorway, meaning to leave the house as inconspicuously as possible by the front entrance. I do not think the plainclothes man at that second door would have stopped me, but as I approached, the white-haired gentleman came through it and said, not unpleasantly, "Miss Sharp, may I help you with anything?" "No, thank you. I only meant to catch a breath of fresh air. I find it rather warm, don't you?" Not particularly, he said. In fact, Midwinter's Day was not far off and, despite the lavish fire burning on the hearth, a definite chill radiated from the large windows that lined the walls. Of course he won't propose, a woman said behind me, a little too loud for the hush that had fallen across the room. She's hardly royal enough, is she? Some of the other servants tittered nastily, and I felt my cheeks heat up a little. Please, I said to Hooper. He looked at me for a long meditative moment with an unbearable sympathy in his eyes. It's all right, Miss Sharp. We all feel that way at first, but you must remember that not all of them are like the one who hurt you. He stood aside then, but I didn't move on. I took a couple of deep breaths, crushing my worries deep down inside again. He was right. What did May have to fear? Eddie was not a monster. May had known him since they were children, and she might be debatably royal, but she was not so low that he could easily harm her, even if he had wanted to. Perhaps I didn't need that breath of fresh air after all. That didn't mean I had no natural curiosity. I slipped out the door and made my circuitous way through drawing rooms, saloons, and galleries, and past the dark back stairs, until I peeped around the corner into the same small anteroom where the dapper gentleman with the pointed beard was still waiting. He had sunk into an armchair and sat with his elbows on his knees and his chin on his knuckles, scowling savagely at the carpeted floor. I had observed him for barely a moment when the library door opened and Prince Eddie led May into the antechamber. Congratulate us, Georgie, the beautiful prince announced. I have asked her, and I suppose we shall tie the knot sometime in the new year. Won't Grandmama be pleased? The scowl vanished. The dapper gentleman leaped to his feet and bowed over May's hand. Well, Eddie, you old dog. He's done better than he deserves. I fear much better than he deserves. Are you quite sure you want the old fellow, May? Thank you, George, I am very happy, she said in that cool, dutiful voice of hers like the clink of glass. Grandmama will be pleased. Now you must come and tell Papa and the others, said George with forced, too loud heartiness. Seeing that they would shortly be coming my way, I retreated silently up the dark back stairs, and shortly the three of them passed beneath my hiding place. Eddie and May went first, hand in hand, and George followed behind them, pulling at his mustache, and scowling at May's heels again. I sat there until I was sure they were gone, wondering if there was some cause for alarm. George was, of course, the prince's younger brother, and it did not take a prodigy to divine that he was less than pleased with his sister-to-be. There was something overdone in his insistence that Eddie had done better than he deserved. No doubt he, like the servants in the drawing-room, looked down on May for her tainted morganatic blood. What more did he want? I asked myself, in vexation as I made my way back to the servants' drawing-room. Had she been full-blooded, she would be a monster, and monsters were thought very little of in England. But she was neither a monster nor full-blooded, and so Prince George meant to look down his nose at her. Within half an hour, May sent for her carriage, and for me. I went out to the brougham when Kitchener brought it around, and stood stamping my feet to keep them warm while May bade farewell to Eddie and his family in the saloon. Full moon tonight, Kitchener? I asked, partly to make conversation. Not till tomorrow night, Miss Sharp. Shall we have it to light us home, do you think? No, miss, it won't rise till midnight, and we'll be turning in at the Queen's drive by then. I brooded on this until the door opened, and May came down the steps. Eddie was not with her, so it fell to me to help her into the brougham, tuck the rug over her lap and settle the hot brick at her feet. As Kitchener drove us up the empty mall on the first leg of our journey home, I leaned back, rubbing my hands to warm them. I hear I am to congratulate you on bringing Eddie up to scratch, ma'am. There was nothing jubilant in her voice. Thank you, Sharp, but you must not speak of the Duke of Clarence in that manner. I beg your pardon, ma'am. Were they very happy with you? Excessively. And you? I hope I shall always do my duty. Really, Sharp, you ask too many questions. It is curiosity, ma'am. I have never been in your position. Nor I in yours. Yet I managed to restrain myself. There was a momentary silence. You ought to go to Scotland Yard tomorrow, Sharp, as we shall be going up to Scotland the next morning. To Scotland? Yes. Since I am part of the family now, I am to spend Christmas at Balmoral with Aunt Queen. I was silent, a little dizzied by the breadth of my experience over the last couple of days. May was to spend Christmas at Balmoral with Queen Victoria, and I was to go with her. Once I had dealt with some business having to do with the murder of my friend in a Whitechapel gutter. I swallowed hard as I thought of Sal's letter. That left me little enough time to follow the lead she had left me, and tomorrow night was the full moon. Would have to act quickly. What kind of danger was I about to face? Sharp. Princess May cut into my thoughts. Is something the matter? No, ma'am. I took a deep breath. I might need to spend a great deal of tomorrow in the city. Something has come up. Something to do with the murder of your friend? Yes. Then of course. Will you tell me about it? I should like to hear. I was not sure if I wanted to share Sal with this girl, who had spent her whole life surrounded by privilege and no doubt only wished for some diversion to while away a tedious journey. Still, what choice did I have? Began by mentioning the letter, and then May asked questions, and in the end I surprised myself by handing over the note, and May read it by the carriage lights, making a little sing-song hum as she finished it. I quite agree with you, she said, handing the letter back to me with an air of decision. I cannot imagine that the woman who wrote this letter would or could have submitted herself willingly to the abuse of a stranger. With that, I had to admit that despite my reservations I was glad I had spoken to her. I ought to have shown this letter to Short straight away. Yesterday, I hate to think how the trail might have gone cold while he was barking up the wrong tree. Which is the right tree, though? What did she mean by the things that go bump in the night? The letter was safely back in my pocket again. I had hoped May did not pay much attention to that line, but I should have known better. I was beginning to learn that she did not do things by halves. I think she was speaking of one of the continental monsters. May drew herself up. Are you referring to my cousins, Sharp? I don't know, ma'am. It might have been a vampire, that is, one of the Russians or Romanians. May thought about that for a moment, but it was too great a pill for her to swallow. Your friend must have been mistaken, she said decidedly. It's hardly credible that she met a continental royalty of any type in a corner of Whitechapel. She must have been taken in by an impostor. Or perhaps she was on her way to a more salubrious quarter, but was waylaid by a maniac with a knife, as this Inspector Short suggests. Really, Sharp, it is very strange to imagine any person of royal birth committing such a dreadful crime. I wouldn't be surprised if the anarchists were behind it all. You may find them in Whitechapel in plenty. I can't say I was surprised by her skepticism. I sighed and tried to be thankful for it. Inspector Short no doubt would have all these arguments and more at his fingers' ends, and May's objections would enable me to form a rebuttal. But indeed the mind boggled any time I tried to imagine someone like the loathsome Duke Ernst Gunther, or the dapper Prince George venturing across London to the slums of Whitechapel to meet an inoffensive former inmate of St. Botolph's Hospital, let alone bloodily murder her. I thought of that murder, and gently traced the scars on my cheek. Short said that the weapon used was a blunt knife, but their graces, the continental royalties, depend for the most part upon tooth and claw. I've seen so many injuries of this sort, and if only I was able to view the body I would know for myself which it was. I only meant to float a hypothetical. May, however, had different ideas. Then, it's settled, she said at once. I'm expected at Marlborough House for dinner tomorrow, but we will drive into London together after lunch and pay a visit to the mortuary. The mortuary? Of course. How else will you satisfy yourself as to your friend's death? I was far from certain that I wished to see the mutilated remains of my friend at all, but the longer I thought about it, the more evident it became that this was in fact exactly what I must do next. Short could not be relied upon to follow the evidence where it led. Only I could uncover the dreadful truth of Sal Tanner. Chapter 9. May pushed open the carriage door as I approached and said, "Dear me, that was quick." They didn't let me in to see her. Finding that I was gripping the carriage door tightly enough to bruise my fingers, I made myself let go. It was too bad to come to such a resolution as I had last night, to lie awake half the night, screwing up my courage, and then to rush Princess May away from the White Lodge immediately after luncheon, only to meet with an unceremonious refusal. At the mortuary itself, the attendant had not even explained why he meant to refuse me. He had barely looked at me long enough to do so. For once I was unable to blame my scars, since I had shrouded my face in a veil to conceal them. May's expression didn't change when she heard this, but she got up and stepped out of the carriage. That will never do. Show me in sharp. Pulling my veil back, I led the way back into the grim-looking building and tapped on a glass-paneled door that opened into a small, dingy office. What is it now? The man inside asked fretfully, but he got up and stood to attention when May entered. She was wearing a charcoal-colored dress with froths of white lace, and carrying an umbrella like a wand of office. I should like to view the remains of Sarah Tanner, I put in. Just so, Sharp. Of Sarah Tanner, if you please, Mr. Rawlinson, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Rawlinson. I shall be greatly indebted to you. Lead on. The sweat stood out on Rawlinson's forehead, and he pulled off his spectacles and polished them nervously. I'm afraid we have very particular orders concerning those remains, ma'am. I do not see why those orders should apply to me, Mr. Rawlinson. I am not just anybody, you know. I am Princess Victoria Mary of Tech. Rawlinson's chin dropped, and he polished his spectacles a little harder. Your Highness, you must forgive me. It's not a sight for a lady. No, May said in tones that reduced the unfortunate Rawlinson to shreds. That is why I sent in my maid at first, because I wished to spare myself, but, alas, some tiresome fellow sent her away again, and I was compelled to come myself. Now I should like to see the remains. Right away, Your Highness, he said, cramming his spectacles back on his nose and stooping to unhook a key from beneath his desk. I looked at May in awe, as privileged and self-absorbed as she could not help being with her narrow experience of the world. She seemed to have adopted Sal's cause as her own, and it was something to know that I had gained such an ally. Rawlinson led us down the ugly corridor, which was painted in a bilious shade of yellow and smelled overpoweringly of carbolic soap, just like St. Botolph's. He unlocked the door into a large chilly room well lit with immense high windows, holding a row of high white tables arranged something like the beds in a hospital. 3 or 4 of the tables held bodies, all of them decently shrouded by a white sheet, of which the one nearest us was somewhat crusted with red and yellow matter, as though the remains beneath it were messy. This is your girl, Rawlinson said conversationally, and twitched back the sheet. May gave a stifled gasp and locked her hands around my arm as though she was afraid her knees might give way. I clenched my teeth, but not quickly enough to prevent a whimper escaping me. I did not want to see, I did not want to smell, but I forced myself to step closer and for a long queasy moment to look. Thank you, I said at last. Please cover her again. The sheet was replaced. At my side, May looked very pale, but she said faintly, I couldn't help noticing that she was altogether, and she put a hand on her breast, touching the charcoal damask. Oh yes, Your Highness, we have to strip them before we can examine them. I see. Well then, where can we look over Miss Tanner's personal effects? I had to admire the steady, methodical way her mind worked. Mine was too busy weaving vast theoretical structures of probability, and if I had been left to myself, that detail would very probably have slipped my mind. Rawlinson led us back to the small office in which we had found him and produced a strongbox together with its key. May and I took out each ragged, blood-crusted item in turn: the tattered black dress, the corset and its cover, the petticoats, padding, knickers and shift. Beneath all these was a pair of pockets made to hang around the wearer's waist beneath her petticoats. We turned them out and found no money at all, but a handkerchief, a small mirror, a penknife, a pencil stub, a long wooden hairpin sharpened to a fine point, a silver hatpin similarly long and sharp, the dried bloom of a foxglove, a lump of sealing wax, a small perfume bottle containing what appeared to be water, and an opened letter somewhat battered. I opened the letter, and the first words arrested my attention. Dear sister, despite all that has happened, I still cannot bear you to think ill of him. Believe he is a dear good boy at heart, only he is too willful to be tamed by any woman. I have secured work at a needle factory, and am presently able to pay the rent on a small room I have taken. I will do as you ask, and write to you if my needs become more than I can bear. But for now I must say goodbye. Ever your fondest. But the name had been blotted out. I turned the paper over to read the direction, but this too had been blotted out with very heavy black ink. Once again I barely knew what to think. Could Sal have had a sister? Could she have discovered her family? The thought struck me like a thunderbolt and I dropped the letter on the table, breathing slowly. Could Sal have discovered her family and never told me? But how? Could she not have assisted me to find my own people? Beside me, May retrieved the letter, her lips moving slightly as she read it. Afterward, she refolded the letter and laid it down on the desk beside the other contents of Sal's pockets. I think we have seen everything, Mr. Rawlinson. Thank you for your assistance. In the old Montague Street, Kitchener was engaged in a lively discussion with a man in a cart who wished to pass through the narrow passage and was threatening to do so at any risk to the Tex brougham. Here at last May seemed at a loss. Where next, Sharp? To Scotland Yard, I suppose. We climbed into the carriage and I sat lost in thought as Kitchener and the angry carter maneuvered to the junction with Hanbury Street, and we turned down Baker's Row. No, on second thought I did not think Sal had found her people. That, she most certainly would have told me. I had allowed my own deepest longings to push me to a false conclusion. The letter found on Sal's body must have been given her by its original recipient, perhaps by the person she had mentioned in her own letter, the one who had sworn her to secrecy. That would explain the blotted-out address. Who was the other letter writer, then? Across from me, May sat with her head back and her eyes shut, looking very pale still in the gray struggling light of the December day. What a horrible sight, she murmured. So you saw her? Yes, and I shall never forget that. You were right, Sharp, and I was wrong, even I could see that. I do beg your pardon. It is not a pleasant thing to be right about, I murmured. As the carriage turned towards the Victoria Embankment, I sighed. It is a shame I did not suspect Inspector Short of being such a dreadful liar. He said that she had been killed with a blunt knife. I don't suppose it could possibly have been that. May spoke wistfully as though she wished she might still believe Sal's killer to have been an anarchist. That, of course, was out of the question. Sal's body had been marked with deep scratches and patterns of 3 that exactly replicated the marks on my left cheek. Her throat had not been severed, but ripped entirely away as though torn out by a wild animal. It was not the only place on her body that had been bitten into. Torn apart by wild dogs would have been a much better lie than slaughtered by a knife-wielding maniac. But then who would believe in a pack of wild dogs roaming through Whitechapel? It was a werewolf, I said, thinking of Inspector Short with a twinge of disappointment. And the police know it, and they are lying about it. I'm sorry, ma'am. May stared out the carriage window, stiff and doll-like as ever. Well, she said at last, one can pardon them for keeping it quiet. Who knows what horrible scenes we might have in London if it was known that Continental royalty had gone mad and was attacking poor women in the streets. The anarchists would be up in arms. All the same, it won't do to think that strangers may come over any day and attack the Queen's subjects in the streets of London. Thank you for helping me, I said sincerely. Her view of the world had received a nasty shock, and she was taking it with remarkable fortitude. I should never have got in to see her if it hadn't been for you. I dare say that awful little man thought me safe, since I am royalty myself. No, Sharp. From now on, you and I are in this together. What use is it to be member of this family if I don't do some good with it? We shall show them that there is one crown in Europe that is not founded upon blood. I was not entirely sure that I liked the idea of May taking over my investigation, for the high-handedness that had assisted me in the mortuary might prove a double-edged weapon should she discover some equally pressing reason to stifle the inquiry. The police, after all, must have such reasons. Still, so far she was with me, and I did not have many other weapons with which to fight. I thought longingly of the small arsenal which Sal must have taken so many pains to collect. A wooden stake and a vial of laudanum to deal with vampires, silver hatpin and wolfsbane for the werewolves, and wax to make earplugs should she happen upon sirens. I myself am not the sort to make detailed preparations for future events. Indeed, if I am honest with myself, I am not the sort to make preparations of any kind. That is why I married my husband, and also how it is amazing how much easier it is to elope when one of you has been carrying the ring around in his breast pocket for months already. By now the carriage had carried us down the embankment nearly as far as Westminster Bridge and turned in at New Scotland Yard, a handsome new building. of red brick and white Portland granite with a pair of rather whimsical-looking turrets at each corner. Inspector Short's card led us to a small, chilly office at the back of the building, looking out over the Richmond Mews. Like its owner, it carried the faint scent of tobacco smoke. Short was surprised to see Princess May with me, but when she had explained that she took an interest in the case, he bowed politely and gave up his own seat so that both of us could be seated. "I trust you have brought me the letter, Miss Sharp?" I handed it over without a word, and he read it with one of his eyebrows raised. This puts a different complexion upon the matter. May I have a copy of this letter?" If he was determined to hush it all up, I couldn't imagine why he should need a copy of the letter, but I could hardly refuse. "As you like, but I expect to have it back." "Of course. I'll have it copied at once. Excuse me for a moment." He stepped out and returned not very long after. "Miss Sharp, you were intimately acquainted with the deceased. Has this letter cast any light upon her movements that night?" "Certainly," I said, glad to have May at my back. "She was going to meet with the werewolf which subsequently killed her." The long thin line of Short's mouth became just a little longer and thinner. "I suppose she did hint as much in her letter, but we cannot presume that in fact we have seen the body," I put in, no longer caring to hear him lie. "You must know as well as we do that if she was not torn apart by wild dogs she was attacked by a werewolf. A knife could never have inflicted such injuries." "Excuse me, Miss Sharp, you say you have seen the body?" "We have just come away from the mortuary," May put in with a delicate shudder. He said again. After a moment, he picked up the file on his desk, rifled through the pages and extracted a piece of paper. He stood looking down at it a moment before speaking again. "The body was found by a constable on his beat and was taken away to the mortuary very soon after, on the orders of the sergeant at the Commercial Street Police Station. I was called in shortly after. Special Branch assured me that I need only see the medical evidence." He handed the paper to May, whose eyebrows lifted as she saw it, before passing it to me. "This, together with a written description, is the closest I have come to seeing the body itself." The paper was an impersonal line drawing of a human body, upon which a series of handwritten notes had been scribbled, together with long slashes to mark what the notes described as cuts and lacerations. The picture it presented was of a much less brutal attack. "And you were satisfied with this explanation?" I threw the paper onto one of the stacks of files and books littering the desk. Until this afternoon, I had no particular reason to doubt that I had been told the truth. He leaned against the windowsill, putting his hands in his pockets, and his gentle, anxious face drew even tighter. I found to my surprise that I believed him. "Did both of you see the body?" "We did," said May, "and between us we supplied a rough description of what we had seen." "So, you see that it must have been a werewolf, don't you?" I asked when we had finished, and the silence began to lengthen. "She said in her letter that she was going to meet one, and given her injuries it seems that that is exactly what she did." He nodded, seeming only half attentive to what I said. "It's tremendously unfortunate, that is, if you don't mind my asking, Miss Sharp, are you trained at all, even informally, in the principles of forensic surgery?" "No, but I hardly need ask you, ma'am." "No." "Then while all this is very enlightening, I do not know on what basis I might demand a second opinion or to see the body myself." "I'm sorry, Miss Sharp. For a moment I had really thought he was going to help. But you agree that it must have been a werewolf, surely?" "I suppose it might have been." "Might. Between you and me, Inspector, which of us do you think is better qualified to recognize the signs of a werewolf attack?" And I got up from my chair to lean across the desk towards him, so that he might see the light from the window fall stark across the claw marks on my face. "We are not accusing anyone in particular, Inspector," May added softly. "But surely if all the signs point toward a German prince of some sort, you will not get far questioning the costermongers of Spitalfields." "Precisely," I said, subsiding into my seat. "And surely the secrecy surrounding the body must make you suspicious. If Sal was murdered by a foreign prince, then of course Special Branch is eager to conceal the fact for fear of anarchist demonstrations." "If that were so, Miss Sharp, they would hardly assign me to investigate it. Perhaps they judged you as the sort of man to do his work without asking Uncomfortable questions. The words must have rankled, for he frowned, his lips drooping yet more at the corners. There was an uncomfortable silence. After a moment I added, I still can't see why Special Branch is handling this at all. You said you didn't suspect anarchists. I'm sorry, Miss Sharp. I'm not at liberty to say more. May rose with a silken rustle. Then who is at liberty to say more? I think you had better send us to speak to your superiors, Inspector. Short straightened and replied with a slight bow. Of course you may ask for a meeting with the commissioner, ma'am, but I doubt he will tell you anything more than I already have. Though May was rather tall for a woman, Short towered above her by a head. Nevertheless, she made a rather successful attempt to look down her nose at him. Do you know who I am, Inspector? Some connection of Her Majesty's, I believe. That took her aback. Haven't you read the Morning Post today? I am not in the habit of reading the Morning Post on any day, alas. Well, if you had, you would know that I am engaged to marry Prince Albert Edward, who is to be your king. Indeed. Allow me to tender my most loyal good wishes, but I do not see how that will make any alteration in the Yard's handling of this case. Infuriating man. Where the mortuary official had withered in the icy blast of May's hauteur, Short merely looked dour and stood his ground. May, however, got the final word. Very well, but I shall mention you to the Prince of Wales, Inspector. Come. Sharp. She turned and marched from the room, and having paused only long enough to send the alarmed inspector a look of insincere condolence, Chapter 10. You won't really speak to the Prince of Wales, will you, ma'am? I asked as we settled ourselves in the brougham. May looked up from arranging her skirts. I will if you think it might help. Sharp. Oh no. Short's refusal had made my blood boil, but there was a small, sneaking part of me that couldn't help admiring the address with which he had met all the slings and darts of outraged royalty. He was far from the champion of justice which Sal needed, but he was no toady, not to royalty at least. Sighed, feeling wistful. I had really had hopes of him. If you were unable to frighten him, he must be very sure in his superiors. So sure, that I do not know if they would heed even the Prince of Wales. Her battle with the inspector had brought the color back to her cheeks. May's eyes flashed, making her look rather splendid. I have never been so affronted in my life, Sharp. I cannot think he can be a very good policeman if that is how he behaves to royalty. We had, I thought with another inner sigh, very different measures by which to evaluate the respective merits of policemen, but Kitchener saved me from having to reply by rapping on the roof to ask where he should take us next. We have given Kitchener an entertaining day at least, I said. Oh, look at the time. I said I would be at Marlborough House by 3. Kitchener hurries, we might just make it. Sharp, I am so angry with that policeman, she added, as Kitchener turned in the direction of St. James. I don't care to do the anarchists' work for them, and speak evil of dignitaries, but it is quite clear that some ghastly continental creature is loose in London. Between you and me, I should not be surprised if it was that horrible Ernst Gunther. Is there nothing else we can do to stop him? I had been chewing over the same question since it had first become clear that Short intended to be of no assistance, and I already had 2 or 3 things in mind. The most important, of course, was the appointment Sal had made me at the Whitechapel Library an hour from now. There are other avenues of investigation, ma'am, but I think it might be best if I followed them alone. They might take me to places where it would not be fitting for you to be seen, or to people who would be reluctant to speak in your presence. I might give you the rest of the day off, but should you be in any danger, do you think? I doubt it, but you know I am equipped to meet it. So was Miss Tanner, she said softly, and I could tell she really worried for me. I hate to imagine how that poor girl must have died. So do I, and that's why I must take the risk. Now before we go to Scotland in the morning. I suppose it must be so, but do take care. I remembered what Kitchener had said last night. Tonight was the full moon, when a werewolf would be at his most savage and beastly. Still, so long as I was safely in my bed by the moonrise, I would run no danger. I will be back by midnight or a little after. May was satisfied with that, and the chance for conversation was at an end, since Kitchener had just drawn up before Marlborough House. I followed May up the steps into the entrance saloon. The house was very quiet, with the drowsy quietness a comfortable house enters into some time after lunch. The lady is in Her Bower answering letters, the Lord is 2 streets away at his club, dozing over the newspaper. The young gentleman is down in Surrey at a shooting party. The young ladies are paying calls. The servants have retreated to their own quarters for a little rest before the evening meal must be served, and peace settles like a dove brooding over calm waters. The princess and I had perhaps 5 seconds to enjoy this postprandial calm before a door opened explosively, and Prince George emerged from the right-hand drawing room. "I say," he said in a whisper that was somehow ear-shatteringly loud. "Wonder if you could spare a fellow a moment, May?" May sent me a look that told me she desired me to accompany her, and followed George into the next room. The apartment that had seemed so gorgeous, glittering with so many jewels and feathers and shiny shirt fronts last night, was dim and gloomy this morning, rather like Prince George's demeanor. Shooting me an irritable glance, he beckoned May over to the window, where each word was as clear as though he had shouted it into my ear. Still, I suppose distance gave him the illusion of privacy. Thus far he had spent most of his life serving in the Navy, a noble calling no doubt, but very strengthening to the vocal cords. "Oh, hang," he began after some throat clearing, clearly very ill at ease. "It's about Eddie." "Oh, don't misunderstand me, May. Demmed fine fellow, pardon my French. Not a bad thought in his head. But that's the problem, you know. Oh, smart girl like you know. All those books you look at and the paintings you read. Demmed fine fellow Eddie, but the brains of a canary. Oh, not that I pretend to know anything. Wasn't brought up to it. Don't mean to start now. But I mean to say, why not call it off? It's been morning posted and all that, but I shouldn't let that bother me if I were you. Everyone will understand." Oh, May's indefatigable and seemed to be wearing him down. "Tell you what. Let's go upstairs now and tell Mother dear." "Thank you, George, but I think that, all things considered, I will keep my word to Eddie." "But hang it, you can't pretend to love him." "I should very much like to keep my own counsel on that, George." She moved away from the window and he caught her arm. "May." I moved forward, ready to protect her, restrained only by the warning look she sent me. May looked down at the offending hand and said mildly, "I was saving that for my husband, George." I have never seen a man move so quickly. He recoiled, nearly tripped over a chair, and flushed to the roots of his hair. He wrung his hands and cried hoarsely, "Being a brute, I know. But you cannot marry him." "Oh." Each of her O's came with its own unique expression, a range of meaning that went from "do go on, you interest me" to "kindly fall downstairs and break your neck." This most recent O was much nearer the latter than the former, and George almost flinched. "Hang it, May. He will make you demmed unhappy." "Why, George, one might be tempted to think you were jealous." It was the thought hovering on my own lips. Last night I had too quickly reached the conclusion that it was May herself he objected to, but the way he looked at her now, and the pleading note in his voice, betrayed he was in the grip of some overwhelming emotion. At her words he trembled, and his face became a shade darker, making him seem for a moment almost frightening. "If you marry him, I will not be answerable for what comes of it." "Thank you, Georgie, but no one is asking you to answer." I stepped between them as they parted. George stood with his fists clenched, and I felt his eyes on us all the way to the door. In the saloon again, May drew a deep breath, and I saw that despite her outward calm she had paled again. "Are you well?" I asked. "Perfectly," she said, cutting the word a little too short. "Tell me if you wish me to stay." "Not for the world." I am more than equal to George, and I had to admit that. She had not been in any need of my assistance this time. "I do believe he's jealous. Whatever he is, I know what my duty is, and he shan't frighten me away from it." Then our whispered conversation was interrupted when the 3 Wales sisters came in from the gallery, cooing and fawning on May like a trio of affectionate pigeons. A moment later I left Marlborough House on my own business, not without certain misgiving. Chapter 11. May having provided me with ample funds, I walked down to Charing Cross Station and took the train to Bishopsgate. Once on the train I extracted Sal's letter from my pocket. I had been careful to retrieve it on our way out of Scotland Yard. It struck me that Short would have seen the postscript on the letter, and would know of my 4 o'clock rendezvous. The dickens would he have the nerve to be there himself? I felt like kicking myself for letting him see the letter, but mature thought convinced me there was nothing I could have done to prevent him. In the meantime, I still had most of an hour before I needed to keep the appointment myself, and the letter bore one other clue I hoped Short might have overlooked. The postal mark on the letter was not difficult to read, and if I was quick I might get to the post office ahead of him. Once I alighted at Bishopsgate Station, it was only a short walk to the post office on Brushfield Street, just across from Spitalfields Market. This was a tiny cramped little shop with sooty windows and a large slatternly but comfortable-looking postmistress wedged behind the narrow counter. She looked at my scars and said, "What can I do for you, love?" in a tone of voice that said she was sorry for me. "You might help me find my sister," I said, putting Sal's letter on the bench and sliding it across to her. It was nearly the truth, after all. This would have been handed in the day before last. "Do you remember the sender at all?" She glanced at the letter and pursed her lips shrewdly. "Maybe I remember, and maybe I don't. I've just had a long man with a short name in here asking the same sort of questions. Said he was from Scotland Yard." "The dickens," I said. "What did you tell him then?" "Oh, I sent him away none the wiser. I don't hold with dobbying and quiet, hard working people to the police. They call themselves anarchists, but I never saw them do anything but good. When my Emily's man broke his leg down at the docks, they were the ones who sent round the hat and kept Emily and her 2 babies out of the poorhouse. Poor Tom. Leg'll never be the same, but he grew up around horses, and my cousin got him work as a cabbie. That's what I call being neighborly. And the police can't even stop fiends murdering us in the streets, can they? Just make life harder for poor blighters like Tom and Emily, and arrest them if they try to say anything about it." I had paid little attention to this speech. At the mention of anarchists, my heart fairly jumped up my throat. Anarchists? Anarchists had posted the letter? What exactly had Sal been mixed up in? Was this the reason Special Branch was involved? I swallowed and collected my thoughts. "I could hug you," I said frankly. "I'm very anxious to locate my sister, but I'd just as well not have a family reunion down at the Old Bailey, if I can help it." The postmistress seemed to think she could trust my scars, for she pushed the letter back to me and got out a pencil, licking the end complacently. It was a Swedish lass, Miss Larson, that handed in the letter. She lives with it. German girl down in Emery's Place. It's but a step. There's the address, and I hope you find your sister, love. I had never heard of Miss Larson in my life, and I felt another stab of pain, for Sal had certainly been concealing things from me. At any rate, my gamble had paid off. Sal had not posted her letter herself, and importantly, I was one step ahead of Short. I left the post office and went directly around to Emery Place, a small cul-de-sac opening off Butler Street about halfway between the post office and Cox's Square, where Sal had died. It was a tiny, dark, noisome sort of place, the houses seeming ready to tumble down, with roof tiles missing and broken window panes that had been boarded up or stuffed with rags to keep the cold out. Miss Larson's address was a room on the ground floor of one of these houses, and as I waited outside the door for someone to answer my knock, an old woman shuffled out of the door that led to higher levels of the building, and said, "Won't be back till 6, love." That was more than 2 hours away, and now I need not hurry to get ahead of Short, since he had gone away none the wiser about Miss Larson. The library was not far, and I still had plenty of time. It was the perfect opportunity to visit St. Botolph's. I don't think I have mentioned that St. Botolph's is in Aldgate on the Houndsditch Road, just across from the grey brick church of the same name. I knocked at the door, and when it opened, letting out a wave of carbolic scent, I said, "Hello, Jemima. I happened to be in the neighborhood, so I thought I'd drop by." The housemaid stared at me with an open mouth. "Coo, is everything all right with your new position, then?" "Oh yes, Princess May and I are getting on famously." I walked into the entryway, pulling off my woolen coat. "No, you needn't bother, Miss Scrimpson. I only came." But it was too late. The director's office opened, and Miss Scrimpson emerged and looked me up and down in sour triumph. "Elizabeth, I thought I heard your voice. I admit I had my doubts about the suitability of this position for one of your unruly temperament, but I would have expected you to last a little longer than this." "On the contrary, I was just telling Jemima how very well I have been getting on at the White Lodge. I thought I would just come around and set an example." of deferential service to the other girls. Lord knows they need it, the poor. Silly hoydens. Miss Scrimson seemed not entirely sure whether I was laughing at her or not. I must own I was rather intoxicated just then by the thought that I would never have to answer to her again. May might throw me out into the street any day, of course, but I realized I would rather take to highway robbery rather than throw myself on St. Botolph's charity again. I am shocked by your levity, Elizabeth. This house does necessary work, as you of all people should know. So I've always heard, I said politely, judging that the present was not the time for open hostility. As a matter of fact, I came to ask about poor Sal. Oh, Sarah. Yes, a sad business. But she remained standing in the hallway, blocking my path further into the house, nor did she invite me into her office. A face peered through the door behind her. Hannah Bunker must have been in the middle of a scolding. I was surprised to hear that Sal left St. Botolph's the day before she died. So were we all. I was here that morning. She showed no signs of intending to leave. Indeed. Clearly, Miss Scrimson had no intention either of letting me into the house, or of telling me why Sal left it. Please, Miss Scrimson, I was her friend. You must tell me something. I have spoken to the police about it, and I don't mean to explain myself to you, she said, advancing towards me. I think you had better leave. Elizabeth, you have a mistress to attend to. Explain yourself? I protested. Intuition supplied the meaning of her words. Why did you throw her out? I will not explain myself to you, she repeated, seizing the door and holding it open. Now will you go, or must I send Hannah for a policeman? Oh, send Hannah to the grapes, I said, retreating onto the step and allowing Miss Scrimson to slam the door in my face. There were 3 public houses in the immediate vicinity of St. Botolph's. One very large one opening onto the high street, beside the Aldgate station. One medium-sized one immediately next door to the hospital, and one microscopic public house across the lane from the church. It was to the nearest of these, the grapes, that I repaired. I had not been sitting in the sparsely populated parlor there for more than a quarter of an hour when the door opened and Hannah Bunker hurried in, hatless. Oh, Liz, there you are. It's terrible, the way she treated you, and you Sal's nearest friend. She threw herself into my arms, then pulled back with a sniff. Something fishy is happening at the hospital, Liz. I don't understand it. I patted her back consolingly. Hannah was relatively new to St. Botolph's, and had not yet been introduced to our late-night studies. No wonder she was confused. Hush. Sit down. I'm having a tea, do you want one? I'd better not. If I stay out more than a minute she'll know and I'll catch it. Then you'd better sit down quick, and tell me all about Sal. Hannah obeyed, lacing her fingers nervously on the table, and lowering her voice to a whisper. It seemed that an hour or 2 after I had left the hospital, Sal had had a visitor, a young woman, shabby but respectable, with a country accent and hayseeds in her dowdy woolen coat. I made Hannah describe the girl, but it did me little good. Sal's visitor was of medium height, with brown hair and eyes, most likely in her 20s, and perfectly nondescript. Anyway, Sal had sat in the courtyard talking to the girl for some time and had subsequently been caught by Miss Scrimson trying to sneak out the back door into Gun Square. The visitor had been sent away, and there had been a row in the director's office, which ended with Sal declaring that she would leave, with only the clothes on her back if she must. At that point Miss Scrimson had locked Sal in her office, and given orders for Jemima to go for the police. But of course Sal was not to be trapped. She had broken the window and got out, and Miss Scrimson had decided not to send for the police after all. I think she was happy to be rid of Sal so easily. Did you happen to hear the visitor's name? I asked. No. I thought at the time she was peculiarly quiet about it. Did Sal say anything about her either? I'm sorry, Liz. I've told you everything I know, and I've no more time to spare. And very grateful to you I am. You're a brick, Hannah. Give my love to the other girls, and tell them I mean to find out who did this to poor Sal. She went away, and having paid for my cup of very indifferent tea, I walked out into Church Row deep in thought. Most likely Sal's visitor from the country, who had hayseeds in her coat but did not readily give out her name, was identical with the person Sal had mentioned in her letter, who had sworn her to secrecy. Moreover, unless Sal's acquaintance was yet broader than I had hitherto suspected, It seemed likely that the mysterious visitor was also the person whose address had been blotted out on the letter in Sal's possession. I glanced at my watch and saw that it was nearly 4. The dickens! I must not let Short get ahead of me again. Hurrying around the corner into Whitechapel High Street, I purchased a white carnation from a flower seller, caught a tram, which delivered me almost to the library steps just as the St. Botolph's church bell struck 4. I had occupied the journey in looking at Sal's letter. If by some chance you do wish to finish my work, go to the Whitechapel Public Library at 4 o'clock with a white flower pinned to your coat. I was supposed to meet someone, it was clear, but whom? The anarchist, Miss Larson, the mysterious visitor to St. Botolph's. Were they, perhaps, one and the same person? And all of it a moot point if Short would be there ahead of me. I could only hope that the delicacy which kept him from tampering with my mail would prevent him from spoiling my tete-a-tete. But I wouldn't bank on it. I climbed the steps into the dark, cool entrance hallway in the hope of finding my quarry waiting in the shadows there, but apart from a passerby or two, this was empty. The lower floor being taken up by a museum, I climbed the stairs to the library and inspected my surroundings attentively. A pair of eyes peered over the top of a newspaper. I met Short's eyes. The dickens! I waited for a moment within the door, my white carnation shining in the gloom, but when no one approached me, I marched over to Short. Will you have the goodness not to interfere in my business, Inspector? He smiled faintly, letting the paper fall across the surface of his reading desk. It's a public library, Miss Sharp. I wouldn't dream of interfering in anything. I hadn't made up my mind how to respond to this when the door opened and closed behind me. I swiveled around. No one was there, but my sensitive hearing picked up the sound of feet descending the stairwell at a rush, and I felt a jolt of alarm. Was this the person I was to meet? Had they flown? A young woman, Short told me in a soft, terse voice quite different from the one he had used a moment ago. His eyes were on the door. Only looked in for a moment. She must have recognized a detective. Chapter 12. Uttering a wordless reproach, I wheeled and went down the stair on the heels of the unseen woman. Wait! I cried. I'm a friend of Sal's. My voice echoed in the tiled darkness which smelled of stale tobacco, cheap gin and upset stomachs, but the footsteps below rushed out into the street without stopping. Moments later I followed her, glancing wildly up and down the street. A tram rang its bell in warning as the doors closed, and I looked in that direction, only in time to see a dark flutter vanish inside. The tram pulled away, going down the Whitechapel High Street toward Aldgate. I put my hand to the white carnation I had pinned to my coat. Sal's friend hadn't even seen the flower. All she had seen was a detective, and that was enough to send her running. A familiar whiff of light perspiration and fresh tobacco told me that Short had followed and now stood beside me. I am terribly sorry, were his first words, and once again I felt sure that he meant them. The acute senses of the werewolf bitten leave us with an instinct for these things. It was my own silly fault, I said gloomily. I ought to have left you behind. Your paper. Can you describe her for me? All I saw was a face, and very quickly, he said, his mouth lengthening. Brown hair and eyes, black clothing and hat, about 20 or 25. Rather nondescript. She might return tomorrow. The letter did not specify a date. She won't, I said with conviction. Not now she knows the police are after her. Even within the cocoon of St. Botolph's, I'd heard enough kitchen maids and tradesmen speak of the police to know that in Aldgate they were seen as little more than the henchmen of the rich, more interested in enforcing the political status quo than in preventing or detecting crime. Given my difficulties with Short, I was beginning to see their point. From Short's long face, he thought my guess correct. I ought to have warned you I would be there. After a moment's hesitation, he offered his arm. I inspected it with a severe air. What is this for? I thought we might talk. We are talking. He smiled faintly. I don't think I had yet seen him smile. It was a rather wistful expression. Perhaps it was because of this that I decided to humor him. Do you write poetry? I beg your pardon? You look as though you ought to write poetry somehow. That interesting, moody look you always have about you. That elicited a broader smile, which quite transformed his face. For a moment, he looked almost boyish. How very underhanded of Scotland Yard to send a good-looking policeman. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Miss Sharp. I chase anarchists and sometimes, in the evenings, I read a little Milton. Oh, they tried to make me read The Paradise Lost at St. Botolph's. Was the most amazingly tedious stuff I've ever had to struggle through. You do look like the kind of person who likes Milton. He, unlike Miss Scrimson, seemed quite sure I was laughing at him, for he bowed to hide the twinkle in his eyes. I am honored. But at least you've come clean with me. You are chasing anarchists. Not at present, I'm afraid. And he indicated the quiet street. Do you have any notion who the young lady might have been? Wickedly, I repeated his own words from earlier that afternoon. Sorry, Inspector, but I'm not at liberty to say more. He laughed softly and replaced his bowler hat on his head. Obstruction of justice is a crime, Miss Sharp. Then perhaps I ought to make a citizen's arrest, Mr. Short. I'm getting on nicely in solving this case, but there's a vexatious policeman who keeps hiding important pieces of evidence and frightening my witnesses. Ah, but it's not obstruction of justice if I do it. Yes, I know one rule for you and a different one for me, not because you are any more clever or just than me, but because you have more powerful people protecting you. Does that seem fair to you? It seems like the best way to get the job done. Yes, I suppose it does from your point of view. But if you look at it from mine, Miss Sharp, this is very diverting, but I must ask you to answer my questions. It had been shaping up as a promising argument and I was sorry to have to abandon it. Very well, I said with dignity. We can continue this debate in the future. I will answer your questions if you answer mine. I cannot promise to do that. Don't jump to conclusions. I only want you to show me where Sal died, I told him, and I want to know who was seen in the vicinity of the murder immediately before and after it happened, and I want to know exactly how Miss Scrimson explained herself to you. Oh, is that all? Yes, unless I think of something else. He thought about that for a moment, then bowed and offered his arm. Very well. Shall we? We shall. As far as I knew, I had never gone walking with a gentleman before. It was rather pleasant, strolling up Whitechapel High Street arm in arm with Short, who was large enough to provide a little shelter and warmth from the raw December wind. As we walked, I related what Hannah had told me, together with my conclusions about the visitor and the writer of the letter. He could and likely would question Hannah and the other St. Botolph's girls, so there was little point in being mysterious about what she had told me. I did not, of course, say anything about the postmistress on Brushfield Street or the mysterious Miss Larson of Emery Place. Short said when I was finished. Miss Scrimson said nothing about a visitor to me. She told me she had found out that Miss Tanner was keeping low company, and having confronted her about it, was defied. According to her, Sal broke the window in a fit of pique before being allowed to depart of her own free will. The story sounded fishy to me at the time, but it's important to move quickly in cases of this nature, and I had other business to attend to. From Middlesex Street, we went up Cobb's Yard and emerged into a small square. Tall, grimy buildings surrounded it on all sides, their bricks black with smuts and their windows seeming like so many eyes under so many beetling brows staring down at us with anger and suspicion. I shivered, and Short pointed to the corner to our left where a covered alley led back in the direction of Sandy Row. That is where it happened. It was now approaching 5 o'clock. Dusk was gathering and the lamps were lit. The place where Sal had died was sheltered both from the wind and from the light of the lamps, and I could imagine how dark it must have been that night. Short stopped just before the covered alley began, and I bent down to see the dark rusty stains on the pavement, and the spatters against the wall. Behind the wall itself was decorated. Some had left scraps of flowers that now tumbled across the square in the cold wind, and others had chalked messages of condolence, insult, or solicitation on the wall near the bloodstains. High above these marks was a long chalky smear, showing where a longer, bolder message had been partially washed from the stones. What happened there? I asked, pointing. I'm not at all really, Short. If you say that one more time, there'll be a second murder. He cleared his throat. It was an anarchist sentiment. We removed it at once. Naturally. There have been enough dynamite outrages in Paris and St. Petersburg without bringing them here. I can't blame you for washing the wall, but don't you think the best way to Prevent dynamite outrages in St. James might be to prevent werewolf outrages in Whitechapel. Miss Sharp, I can only do my own job. I'm still at a loss as to why a murder in Whitechapel is your job. Shouldn't something like this fall to the Criminal Investigation Department? Short plunged his hands into his pockets with a deep sigh. It's my chief's view that the anarchist slogan requires our attention at Special Branch. Miss Tanner was of interest to the anarchists here in Whitechapel, but why? Doesn't that strike you as rather a thin story? I was genuinely curious. Surely both of us had ample evidence that Scotland Yard was trying to hush this case up, not solve it. The obvious explanation for Special Branch's involvement was that the culprit was a werewolf, and they had to be seen to investigate the case without actually solving it. No, it doesn't, Short replied doggedly. I opened my mouth, but he went on. Do you recall the Walsall bomb factory case? We arrested 6 anarchists who had been manufacturing bombs in the Midlands, most likely for use in Russia. It was small clues like these that led us to that factory. Can you imagine what might have happened if we had failed? The lives lost in Russia, the recriminations, perhaps war, when it was learned the bombs had been made in England under the noses of the English police? We can't afford to let our attention slip for a moment. Yes, I read about that in the papers. As I recall, it was a case of entrapment. The ringleader turned out to be an agent of the French government. He organized the plot and then betrayed it. I shook my head in disgust. Miss Scrimson had praised the Frenchman's cleverness, but later Sal and I had found Jemima in the outhouse in tears. A friend's sweetheart had been among those arrested. Thankfully, at least 2 of them were acquitted. Funny old business that was. Sal was of the opinion that someone at Scotland Yard had leaked the provocateur story to the press, and after that the cat was out of the bag. It wasn't a leak. Short caught himself. The dickens! I cried. Was it you who talked? It was, wasn't it? I'll bet. Your chief was delighted about that. His mouth pulled long and tight. I was within my rights to say what I said. And you're quite right. It was a dirty trick, and I didn't care to see those men prosecuted as though they alone bore the blame. I believe in justice, Miss Sharp. But they still made the bombs. To my surprise, I found that I could respect his point of view, even if I could not quite share it. His explanation over, Short gestured to the pavement, and began to describe how the body was found, fallen on the footpath against the wall. With some difficulty, I put anarchists from my mind and turned my attention to the scene of the crime. Was Sal holding a weapon at all? I asked him. Or did she have any silver about her? A hatpin was found in the covered alley, and the hat a little further into the square. Is that what you mean? I hate to think of a woman trying to defend herself with such a weapon. He raised an eyebrow at me. What in the world? Miss Sharp. I had got gingerly to my knees, and was sniffing the pavement around the bloodstains. A strong, unpleasant medley of dirt, soot, leather, horse manure, and blood assailed me, and I sneezed and got up. I thought there might be some trace of a recognizable scent, but no. It's been far too long since the thing happened, and half of London has been here since. His eyes opened even wider, and I sighed. The gift of a werewolf bite includes a strong sense of smell. He frowned slightly. What do you mean, recognizable? I meant that I had already met and scented the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, and wondered if I might catch his distinctive whiff, but I was hardly going to admit that I already had a suspect. Well, I hedged. You know what a dog smells like. I don't suppose a wolf is much different. So, I added, getting up and shaking my skirt. Did anyone see the body? Beside the police. The constable came up Fisher's Alley on his usual beat. Short pointed to the covered alley. The body was still warm when he came upon it, and the murderer must have fled moments before. I've spoken to a great many people who claimed to have seen various things, but so far there's only one solid lead. A laborer returning from work along Tripe Yard within 10 minutes of the murder says he passed a young woman running in the direction of Sandy's Row. She was still running when she passed the corner of Sandy's Row and Frying Pan Alley. According to a greengrocer who has a shop there, she was wearing a very distinctive garment, a hooded cape in scarlet wool. We've been looking for the woman, but nobody of that description has come forward. Something in his tone made me stare at him. You think a woman did this? Perhaps she herself had been bitten by a continental royalty, Short said, with a pointed look at me. I must admit that, combined with the chalk lettering, was the anarchist slogan written up there when your constable appeared on the scene. We don't know. His attention was on the body. I see. We must consider all the possibilities, Miss Sharp. Except the obvious one? Short only smiled and said, What makes you think I haven't considered the obvious one? It's getting late. Allow me to call you a cab. He walked me back to the Bishopsgate Street, hailed a hansom and paid it to take me to St. James. I accepted gracefully. I did not want to go to St. James, but Short would almost certainly follow me if I refused, and after the debacle in the library I meant to keep my next lead to myself. By the time I arrived at Marlborough House, Big Ben was chiming 6 o'clock, and it was fully dark. Thanks, Jim, you needn't stay, I told the cabbie, but I didn't re-enter the house. Instead, I set out again to Charing Cross Station and took the train directly back to Bishopsgate.